Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hi everyone. I think Shakespeare expresses the complaint at the heart of Dickens's hard times when he says, "The man that hath no music in himself, nor is not moved with concord of sweet sounds, is fit for treasons, stratagems, and spoils. The motions of his spirit are dull as night, and his affections dark as Erebus. Let no such man be trusted. Mark the music." In the opening chapters of Hard Times, the eminently practical schoolmaster, Thomas Gradgrind, is walking home when he is disturbed by the sight of Sleary's travelling circus. Gradgrind edges closer to it, ready to haul any of his pupils away from its corrupting influence. He is struck dumb, however, to discover that his own children, Tom and Louisa, are there peeping through a booth at the entertainment. In spite of their rigorous upbringing in mathematical exactness and science, fancy has still called the Gradgrind children away from those walls of hard facts, smothering them at Stone Lodge. There is a lesson here, not for Tom or Louisa, but Gradgrind himself, and because he fails to learn it that day, tragic events are set in motion. Dickens puts it Shakespeareanly himself when he asks, "Dost thou think that thou wilt always kill outright the robber Fancy lurking within, or sometimes only maim him and distort him?" Today's guest is a professor of English at Williams College, Massachusetts. He is also an alumni of both Columbia and Princeton, with a specialism in 19th century literature, sociology, and culture. His book, The Comfort of Strangers, Social Life and Literary Form, for Oxford University Press, examines that Victorian phenomenon of new people emerging everywhere in the great cities as industrialization takes its hold in the 19th century, and how authors such as George Eliot, Oscar Wilde, Henry James, and of course Dickens, respond to it. He also wrote the introduction to the Longman edition of Hard Times. I'm speaking of the inimitable Gage McWeeny. And joining Gage today to read extracts from Hard Times is my dear friend Ben Eagle, who I had the pleasure of touring a show in the US with a few years back. The music in this episode is by the Bookshop Band. They've written a song called The Tumbling Girl, which is a response to Hard Times that moves through the eyes of characters such as Sissy Jupe and Louisa Gradgrind, and you're going to hear it in full at the end. Gage, hello, welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire.
I'm thrilled to be here, Dominic. I'm very happy to have an opportunity to talk about Hard Times with you.
Oh, me too. And I suppose really the first question I had in mind was, you've reread it for our conversation. I've read it for the first time for our conversation. But what jumped out at you from this rereading this last week?
It's interesting. So there's a Angus Wilson line, I think, about this novel. It says, it's more of like a menu card for a meal rather than an invitation to a huge feast. And I think in some ways, Hard Time gets a little bit overlooked because it doesn't have that kind of sprawling capaciousness of something like Bleak House or Our Mutual Friend. But the thing that I was struck by was it's in some sense Dickens at his most polemical. This book is a book that is sort of really on a mission. It's about the condition of England. It's about industrialization. And in fact, Dickens had just gone up to Preston to report in on a strike where workers had been shut out, even on the threat of a strike at a mill, and had written this story called On Strike, which he published in Household Words. And Hard Times is in some sense the kind of fictional, the novelistic entree into this set of problems. And so it's really preoccupied with basically the condition of the working class, a thing that Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx were also interesting themselves in this period in England. It's interested in the conditions of labor. It's interested in the systems of thought that were behind those and in some sense licensing them. So utilitarianism. But I think the thing that struck me was actually what that condensation does. So I was really struck by that. kind of the intensity and energy of it, and the kind of real focus of its mission. And then I suppose I was also struck by, I kept waiting for, and because I'm very good at forgetting the plots of Dickens novels and the details. I mean, yeah, it's one of my special skills. So each time I actually have to reconstruct it for myself. And I often make these little character trees on the kind of back page of whatever edition I'm reading. So I've got all the interconnections for myself as I go along, and it helps me reconstruct it. My character tree for Hard Times is rather small. There are just not that many characters in it. And so I kept waiting for those moments of, what would I call them? Like throwaway comic scenes that are so hilarious and so much fun in many Dickens novels. And they just don't really show up in this novel quite as much. It's funny. That is, it's both grim and it's funny in that kind of like bleakly hilarious way and uniquely bleakly hilarious way that Dickens has. But you don't get these kind of throwaway scenes of like high hilarity that you find in some other novels. But that allows you to really kind of like point your way through this particular set of issues.
Yeah, I sort of feel that. I mean, I agree with you about the plots. I mean, I'm terrible at forgetting plots for Dickens novels because they're this big sort of fast spinning wheel of millions of characters. And one of the things I did like about reading Hard Times was that I wasn't getting to the end of a chapter, starting a new one, thinking, "Oh gosh, how many chapters is it going to be before I have to get back to these people and remember who they are?" You're really close to the characters. I felt, in the book that you really kind of walk the path with them. And you're not left away from them for very long. And I think in some ways that has its merits in some respects, but I think it's misleading. I think if you feel that it being short, it's going to be less effort than reading a larger book. I think.
Yeah.
I learned that.
Yeah, no, I take your point. I mean, I think there's another thing that happens to go along with what you're pointing us to, which is, there's not really a protagonist in this book. That is, in some sense, Louisa, Gradgrind, Tom, Mr. Gradgrind, Bounderby, they're kind of all like protagonists. And they're all kind of not the central figure around which the entire novel constructs itself in the way of, say, like an Esther Summerson in Bleak House, right? For example, like, that, Bleak House has lots of characters, but that Esther Summerson is your central figure. She's one of the narrators. And so when you get this kind of like leveled out field of Dickens characters, what you don't get is like minor characters. And what Dickens often does with these characters, they're strange, right? Like they're eccentric. They have these kind of verbal tics or repetitions often that will allow you to kind of keep track of them with your ear. You know them when they reappear again. They're like automaton. They repeat certain actions over and over again. There's something that doesn't quite work right about those characters. So just thinking about like a I don't know, like a small weed from yes. Bleak House, right? Who's like, or Grandma Smallweed, who's as if she's on a spring and she's like, Charlie over the water, right? She just says these things over and over again. We don't quite get that same set of kind of superfluity of character kind of overflowing with eccentrics in this book. And so I think that there's a way in which you have to keep them all in your head at the same time and follow them all basically equally in Hard Times. I think that has its real powers, but it presents a little bit of like some more cognitive challenges for a reader than you might expect.
Yes, I was sort of thinking about, saying about they're all protagonists in a way and there is no real subplot. Well, at least a few times I noted there are moments where Dickens writes that these characters have been woven, essentially. He describes them as being made of materials. It's almost as if perhaps Coketown is at the center, churning out these characters that are that have their flaws. So possibly there's something in that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's really nice. And you're pointing us to something else, I think, which is this is a novel that is preoccupied with critiquing the machine made and perceptions of the world that are basically governed by those that would see not individuals but populations, not a worker but simply like statistical aggregates. This is the kind of utilitarian thinking, the greatest good for the greatest number. And those accounts of the factories that are just going on in a kind of monotony. And here, when you have actual machines at the center of the novel and as a kind of critique that Dickens wants to put forward, the characters who are a little bit machine-like themselves, they're not like that because of a kind of like overflowing Dickensian imagination. They're products of utilitarian modes of thought. Like they're exemplars of it. There's a little bit more like room for weirdness in some of the other books among those characters, peculiarity. Whereas here they represent something for us.
Yeah, the absence of fancy, flight, imagination,
fancy and humanity and all of those things. I mean, so I think Bitzer maybe is an example of a character who's maybe close to being a kind of minor character within this book. Right, he's there at the beginning when he steps in when Louisa can't give the is it Sissy? I'm sorry. When Sissy can't give a definition of a horse, though she works in a circus, or at least she can't give a satisfactory definition of a horse. And then Bitzer steps in and says, quadruped, omnivorous, does all of that. Yeah. And then that line ends, I think, with thus, and then parentheses, and much more Bitzer. Right? And so the implication being that Bitzer is himself a little bit of an automata because he's a product of this utilitarian thought. He will simply repeat that thing over and over again. If you ask him more facts for more things, he'll just give you more facts, right? So that he's a little bit of a robot. And so there's a kind of close relationship between, I think, that sort of minor character mechanicalness in this novel and the conditions that the novel is actually trying to portray for us. Right? And so there's sort of they're emanations, as it were, of utilitarian thought.
I think what's an interesting tension in the novel, and if Dickens was alive today, I think he'd really feel it, is that he has a problem with the idea of the need for fact all the time, which is what's espoused by Grad Grind. But of course, the flip side is, in the world today, I feel like in public life, we could use a lot of fact. That facts are actually very, very important. So how do we kind of wrestle that? We've gone too far into fantasy, possibly, or I don't know.
No, I know. There's a way in which people sort of, are reverential about storytelling and sort of the context that, I move in and then maybe you move in too, the great power of storytelling. And I'm with them, the pro-storytelling lobby. But we have a problem. I mean, we have a kind of storytelling problem that we're dealing with right now in the political realm and in the social realm. That is, we don't have agreed upon mechanisms for the verification of fact today. And so there's a lot of fancy. There are, conspiracy theories. That's a version of fancy that I think Dickens would be horrified by. But I also think, one of the things that's easy for us to forget is that utilitarianism, it was intended as a kind of liberal reform. That is, the idea was of the greatest good for the greatest number wasn't actually to reduce everyone to a mere number. The idea was, how do you, under the kind of ascent of capitalism and its production of, in theory, more material wealth for more people, how do you extend the benefits of that material wealth to as many people as you possibly can? That doesn't quite come through in the novel because Dickens is so focused on the critique of utilitarianism that any possibility of a kind of social conscience existing within it, that's like off the radar screen.
Utilitarian economists, skeletons of schoolmasters, commissioners of fact, gabblers of many little dog's-eared creeds, the poor you will have always with you. Cultivate in them, while there is yet time, the utmost graces of the fancies and affections, to adorn their lives so much in need of ornament, or in the day of your triumph, when romance is utterly driven out of their souls, and they and a bare existence stand face to face, reality will take a wolfish turn and make an end of you.
There's another funny thing that comes up in this novel. I'm not sure that we actually learn in granular level detail about, say, how do power looms actually work in, say, textile mills in the 1840s in England. We don't learn in detail about, say, what is it like to be a member of a union. We don't get really, really vivid accounts of Stephen Blackpool's, apartment, his house. We get a little bit, but it doesn't do all that kind of self-footnoting stuff. It doesn't open up a little like Wikipedia entry about cholera, for example, right? Or some other kind of like set of conditions that people are really, really interested in. And I can't help but think it's a little bit because the book is so invested in fancy rather than fact that it's trying really carefully not to become overly Gradgrindian itself and give us too much, at the level of fact, like give us entertainment.
Yes. He sort of has admiration for the circus company, doesn't he? Sleary's crew and everything. Sleary's that's a great name, isn't it? Described as never sober and never drunk.
No, it's terrific, and also because it's this kind of alternate world formation, right, outside of the realm of Coketown and industrialization, and it's itinerant, so it moves around. It's a little bit of a utopia. Dickens himself, I think, is equally torn between high entertainment, that is, wants to make you laugh no matter what. Dickens, when he was courting his wife, he jumped in through the window of his wife's family's house, like played a little hornpipe jig, did a dance, then jumped out the window, closed the windows back up, and then went and knocked on the front door as if nothing had happened. Right? So he's totally dedicated. Somebody said this recently. It's like, it's always a birthday or always a funeral for Dickens, right? Like it's always on one end or the other. So he's totally dedicated to this extremity. So he wants the novel to entertain you, but he also wants it to instruct. Like he really wants you to be a better person at the end of this novel, and that in some sense, the world will be a better place for your having read it. The problem being, of course, that the problems he's talking about are systemic. And, this is the period where, in the kind of the 1840s and the 1850s, where as a novelist, he just gets a lot more sociological. That is, people aren't bad people just because they're bad, just because they're inhumane or something. Characters, we begin to see them and understand them as being shaped by laissez-faire thinking. They're shaped by utilitarianism. They're shaped by industrialization itself. And if you think about Dickens' characters, like there's always something a little bit violent in the worlds that he depicts. And that shows up everywhere. It shows up in the kind of most innocuous of things. So it shows up at the level of like, who is it? I think it's Gradgrind's neckerchief, his very neckcloth, trained to take him by the throat with an unaccommodating grasp, like a stubborn fact, as it was. That sense of like a violence being visited upon or having been visited upon a character is pretty common in Dickens. That is, often characters feel a little bit stunted, or there's like something a little bit out of whack with them, or they're kind of really bound in by their clothes, or you're like bursting at their seams. There's this really crazy sense of people as kind of on the edge of something in Dickens. And often that feels like they are themselves marked by a world that can be quite rough, right? They can be quite savage. It can be quite pitiless. And that world is something like industrial modernity. And when I talk to my students about Dickens, when I'm like, okay, come on into this world, you will notice that characters are strange in Dickens novels. And one of the things that Dickens is trying to register with those characters is what I call like Looney Tunes modernity, or like Pixar. That is, they're comical and they're in some sense like made distended, rolled out really too thin or too wide or something like that. They're cartoonish, but the cartoonishness has a kind of purpose there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think his opening descriptions of Bounderby, who, for the wrong reasons, is an absolute favourite of mine. I mean, what a dreadful person that he is, but he manages to be entertaining, I think, a little bit as well. He brings quite a lot of the humour, things like descriptions of him swelling up to the size of a soap bubble or something without his beauty.
Yes, that's right. No, it's perfect.
Who was Mr. Bounderby? He was a rich man, a banker, merchant, manufacturer, and whatnot. A big, loud man, with a stare and a metallic laugh. A man with a great puffed head and forehead, swelled veins in his temples, and such a strained skin to his face that it seemed to hold his eyes open and lift his eyebrows up. A man with a pervading appearance on him of being inflated like a balloon and ready to start. A man who was always proclaiming his old ignorance and his old poverty. He had not much hair. One might have fancied he had talked it off, and that what was left, all standing up in disorder, was in that condition from being constantly blown about by his windy boastfulness. I hadn't a shoe to my foot, and as to a stocking, I didn't know such a thing by name. I passed the day in a ditch, and the night in a pigsty. That's the way I spent my 10th birthday. Not that a ditch was new to me, for I was born in a ditch.
There's something within Dickens in which when you're reading those things like Bounderby, and you know that he's a bad guy, and yet you're delighting in the kind of characterization and his the kind of hilarity of that, you sort of cringe a little bit. So like James Harthouse in this book, he's this kind of aristocratic guy. He's been sent to do some investigations. And Harthouse is he's bored. He's got this kind of languid manner. He can't take an interest in anything. And he's the real villain of the book, except for the book says you can barely even say that he's a villain because he's so indifferent to everything. Like that he doesn't even have the energy.
Can't even be bothered to be the villain. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. There's one bit I think he's talking to Mrs. Sparsit or something. He's paying her a compliment and he loses interest in the compliment halfway through. I think that's
halfway through.
Yeah, so well put.
I don't know if this is a television show that has made its way over to the UK, over to England, but there's a show called Succession with Matthew McFadyen.
Oh, okay. Yeah, right. Big fan.
I was kind of thinking about this book, and I was thinking about a kind of irony about this book, which is I think it's the one that is most frequently assigned to high school students in the U.S., in places where high school students are still, asked, invited, forced to read Dickens. And I think that teachers choose it because it's the shortest and because it's got a lesson in it, right? That is, it feels like, okay, it's got something we can, we've got the kind of moral of the story here. We can really kind of focus on this. And of course, that is exactly the kind of mathematical, calculative thinking that is, okay, what's the least number of pages that we can still get someone to read a Dickens novel in? It's precisely the thing that he rails against, that Dickens is like indicting in this novel, that is those who think merely in numbers. And so I was thinking, like, the kids today, they should read Great Expectations. That's about being young. It's about, it's a Bildungsroman. It's about, intensities of desire and class mobility and this kind of, these sort of shameful aspirations. And then I thought, Hard Times, though, it's got a Succession quality to it that is sort of rapacious titans of industry, a kind of family plot within it, like a bad family member named Tom. It really, like, I thought, okay, if they're going to redo this, Matthew McFadyen, just bring him back in. He can play Tom. He's got a good character, good character for that. You might have to update it a little bit. But then it struck me as actually like, no, like we're living in a time of Elon Musk-y, rapacious, titans of industry. Maybe this is a book actually, and its accounts not only of particular individuals as kind of, this is what business thinking does to the world, pure capitalism, raw capitalism, unadorned capitalism does to the world, but also the systems of thought that sort of enable it or that stand behind it. That is, maybe this book does feel a little bit more contemporary and up to date than I'd sort of remembered it myself.
Yeah, you've mentioned that a couple of times, the idea of thought being restricted to the point where, when Gradgrind asks Sissy what her name is, and she says Sissy, he said, well, that's not a name.
That's no name.
Yeah, that's not a name. Cecilia, and she said, my father calls me that. Well, he shouldn't. He has no right to. Tell him not to.
Right.
And you think, gosh, so what we're allowed to say, what we feel we're able to say, or there's only a set number of terms that we can use for things. Yeah. So I do think it's quite.
Yeah.
I could see a trace of path to 1984, possibly, which is obviously way more intense. I think what's interesting also from a parental point of view is the effect where, as Tom Gradgrind Sr. is trying to educate his children in this system so that they have amazing powers of reason and they know lots of facts, and he pulls them away from the circus at the very beginning of the novel. And of course, Tom ends up running towards the circus for safety and refuge at the end, and Sleary helps and all of this. It's such an interesting idea that the kids run towards the very thing that you're trying to shut out of their lives. I just think that's a really interesting message in the book.
It's a lesson for all of us who are parents, Dominic. In fact, precisely the thing that you forbid is the thing that they're absolutely going to run to. But yeah, it's an incredibly constrained system, the one that Dickens is showing us here, right? And that it's got a name. I mean, it's utilitarianism. That is the kind of mode of thinking that is only interested in people in terms, not in their individuality, right, but in terms of people in the aggregate. That is, so when Sissy Jupe is asked, what would you say that in a city of 1 million, only 500 or so died in this horrible way? What would you say to that? Isn't that a good thing? And she, and her basic response is, well, I'd have to ask the people who are suffering. Like it would make a very big difference to them, actually, at the individual level. And I mean, this is one of the things that 19th century novel in particular is really dedicated to. In one sense, it's dedicated to this kind of big picture figuring or representing what we'd call the social totality, that is a whole world, right? A whole social formation. But it's utterly dedicated to telling the stories of individuals. And this is happening, historically in a period when there are all these kind of what we might just call like these big tides of massification that are happening. So industrialization, people are moving from the country into the city, right? Aggregating in cities, living closer to one another. Industrial labor is bringing people into factories, and so bringing them together in kind of massive numbers. National identities. This is the great age of the nation state and the forming of nations. So that is the idea that one would be a member of a nation and you would feel it, like it was part of your soul. Likewise, like class identity, like a working class identity. This also is emergent in the 19th century. So all these kind of big forces of collectivization. But if you just think about the titles of so many novels in the 19th century in the English tradition, how many of them have a name for a title? Right? So Jane Eyre or Oliver Twist or David Copperfield or Daniel Deronda or Emma or Jude the Obscure, they're dedicated to magnifying the importance of the individual. And so magnifying the individual, placing the experiences of an individual, it's in some sense compensatory for these kind of big waves of collectivization that are kind of occurring in the background. Within this book, I think part of what's interesting is the ways in which Gradgrind is, he's up in his observatory, and there's a funny joke in there about he's not exactly a blue beard, but he's got all these blue books. And those blue books are these parliamentary reports, condition of England stuff, things on poverty and on disease and things like that. And it says there's no window in his observatory. He doesn't really need one because he can just tally up what should be done with the population just through calculation on his slate. And then he can wipe it out.
His character was not unkind, all things considered. It might have been a very kind one indeed, if he had only made some round mistake in the arithmetic that balanced it years ago.
There's this tension between big picture aggregate thinking or like social system thinking on the one hand, and then like telling the story just of individuals on the other.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's almost as if the central characters can't quite take the stage in the novel because the machine and the systems that they've imposed on themselves throw them out again. I think what's also really interesting is the effect on the Gradgrind children of their upbringing. So in a very fixed, highly principled, puritanical way of feeding them utilitarianism throughout their lives, they go in different directions, don't they? So Louisa becomes the girl number, whatever she was in the classroom. She's not important. Yeah. What she wants, she doesn't know. She's unimportant. And then Tom goes the other way of only caring about himself and just going, right, well, the most sensible thing I should do to make myself get on in life is this. I could use this person, this person, this person. Right. So I think that's a fascinating fallout between those two siblings there.
Yeah, and it obviously, it maps onto gender, right? So that like the male character takes this as an opportunity to have loads of self-importance. And Louisa is, this is something that kind of irritates people sometimes about Dickens. She's one more woman who's really self-effacing in a Dickens novel. And his female characters often are like Little Dorrit or Esther Summerson, who's always apologizing for writing about herself. There's a way, though, in which that kind of relative weakness is actually often the mark of a protagonist in a Dickens novel. So like Pip is kind of a weak character, right? Like the world comes at him. And in the case of Louisa, she's all the better able to register the ways in which circumstances sort of circumscribe her, right? And the ways in which the world is shaped her, and her agency is thinned out.
"It's all right now, Louisa, it's all right, young Thomas," said Mr. Bounderby. "I'll answer for its being all over with father. Well, Louisa, that's worth a kiss, isn't it?" "You can take one, Mr. Bounderby," returned Louisa, when she had coldly paused and slowly walked across the room and ungraciously raised her cheek towards him, with her face turned away. "Always my pet, ain't you, Louisa?" said Mr. Bounderby. "Goodbye, Louisa." He went his way, but she stood on the same spot, rubbing the cheek he had kissed with her handkerchief until it was burning red. "What are you about, Lou?" her brother sulkily remonstrated. "You'll rub a hole in your face." "You may cut the piece out with your penknife if you like, Tom. I wouldn't cry."
And then ultimately, right, when Louisa sees Stephen Blackpool, she's able to see not workers in aggregate, but a worker, an individual, and a human. And it's always the case in Dickens that its contact with another person produces a kind of individuating effect, and sympathy, compassion, all of those things. The difficulty being, or the kind of intractability being, that those kinds of individual affections aren't adequate as responses to the big systemic problems that they're facing. And this is what the novel often does. It tries to resolve in the kind of marriage plot, right? The kind of social problems that it can't resolve at the level of politics or ideology or something like that. And I talk to my students sometimes about this, where I'm like, okay, imagine a movie, and the movie is democratic, socialist, progressive, lefty activist falls in love with a hedge fund, MAGA-loving, guy, right? And it's an impossible, who could imagine these two people would find each other? But they each find a way to see a little bit from each other's point of view. And ultimately, right, the hedge fund guy's made a little bit less hedge fundy, and the progressivists have made a little bit less judgy or something like that. I mean, this is basically Pride and Prejudice, right? That is, and so arrive at a kind of compromise or a kind of medium, and they get married. And we would find that could be a terrible movie, of course, but it could be, a satisfying resolution to that plot. But it would, of course, leave in place all of the actual political, social conditions that had produced those contradictions and those problems in the first place. And that's what Dickens always kinds of leaves us with, just an ability to point to the problems at the other level without actually, we don't get a lot of like, and now go call your congressional representative or your member of parliament at the end of a Dickens novel. It's, be good to those around you. I'm with him, of course. And it's very easy to not do that, right? In the name of thinking, oh, well, that doesn't do enough. But that's kind of the beginning rather than the end.
Let us strike the keynote, Coketown, before pursuing our tune. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever, and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it, and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye, and vast piles of buildings full of windows where there was a rattling and a trembling all day long, and where the piston of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down, like the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness.
there's a radical vision in there. And the radical vision, I think, is a sociological one. That is often for Dickens, all those kind of those really fantastical rhetorical figures in this book, like the mad melancholy elephants or the serpents of the smoke, those render vivid what is a kind of dark and depressing condition. But one of the things they do is they kind of defamiliarize the world in a way so that we can see it fresh, so that we can actually really see it in a way that if we're just driving through, an industrial town that we've driven through many, many times, we just stop noticing the chemical waste pool over here. Dickens is trying to make them into these kind of fanciful figures in order to allow us to actually see them. That's like half the job for him.
Yeah, and we've touched on this really, but obviously the idea that money is what's going to save you. And you mentioned marriage a moment ago. And of course, there's the main marriage between Louisa and Bounderby, which obviously should never happen, and it does.
Right.
And then there's the marriage that can't happen between Stephen and Rachel. And they have one of the most tender, loving friendships between the two of them. And I find that incredibly poignant, actually, in the book.
Yeah.
The lights in the great factories, which looked, when they were illuminated, like fairy palaces, or the travellers by express train said so, were all extinguished, and the bells had rung for knocking off for the night, and had ceased again. And the men and women, boy and girl, were clattering home. Old Stephen was standing in the street. "Yet I don't see Rachel still," said he. It was a wet night, and many groups of young women passed him, with their shawls drawn over their bare heads and held close under their chins to keep the rain out. He knew Rachel well, for a glance at any one of these groups was sufficient to show him that she was not there. At last there were no more to come, and then he turned away, saying in a tone of disappointment, "Why then, I missed her." But he had not gone the length of 3 streets when he saw another of the shawled figures in advance of him. Making his pace at once much quicker and much softer, he darted on until he was very near this figure, then fell into his former walk and called, "Rachel!" She turned, being then in the brightness of a lamp, and raising her hood a little, showed a quiet oval face, dark and rather delicate, irradiated by a pair of very gentle eyes, and further set off by the perfect order of her shining black hair. It was not a face in its first bloom. She was a woman 35 years of age. "Ah, lad, 'tis thou?" When she had said this, with a smile which would have been quite expressed, though nothing of her had been seen but her pleasant eyes, she replaced her hood again, and then went on together. They had walked some distance, and were near their own homes. The woman's was the first reached. She stopped at the corner, and putting her hand in his, wished him good night. "Good night, dear lass. Good night." She went with her neat figure and her sober womanly step down the dark street, and he stood looking after her until she turned into one of the small houses. There was not a flutter of her coarse shawl, perhaps, but had its interest in the man's eyes, not a tone of her voice, but had its echo in his innermost heart. When she was lost to his view, he pursued his homeward way, glancing up sometimes at the sky, where the clouds were sailing fast and wildly. But they were broken now, and the rain had ceased, and the moon shone. Looking down the high chimneys of Coketown on the deep furnaces below, and casting titanic shadows of the steam engines at rest upon the walls where they were lodged. The man seemed to have brightened with the night, and he went on.
I think you're absolutely right. It is entirely, almost implausibly platonic relationship between Stephen and Rachel. Their devotion to one another, and then her devotion to his wife, who is suffering from addiction and all kinds of mental health issues. It's in this kind of suspended state in the novel. That is, it's not going to resolve anything by producing a marriage at the end. We kind of think, well, maybe there's some way as we're reading along that those two could end up together. And the novel doesn't give it to us. Right? Like Stephen dies, Rachel continues and continues to minister to those around her and is this good-hearted person. We also get this, I mean, the ending of the novel is very strange. I don't know if we want to talk about it, just yet, but it doesn't quite end in the usual way with, let me give you an account of all the marriages. Instead, it ends with people imagining what their futures might be. Bounderby looking at his portrait and imagining a future. And then arrives at a moment where it says, did he foresee his own death on the street at this time? He did not. And then Louisa, did she imagine having another husband and maybe having children and having a new life? And we get a little bit of a picture of that. So it both gives us that image, and then it says, no, like that didn't happen. The one marriage we do get, right, Sissy Jupe, she does marry. We don't find out a lot of details, but she becomes this sort of, model of maternal care that often shows up in Dickens. And like, that's the marriage we get to help kind of put some closure on at the end of the novel.
Yes, of course. It's only in the last few paragraphs, isn't it, that we know? I'd sort of forgotten that when I just lined up those two other marriage ideas. Yeah. Just talking about the idea of fancy again, it's almost as if the system and the world that these characters are in, if they're not imaginative people naturally, because of either through their lack of imaginative powers or just because of their circumstances, when they do have moments of imagining, it can be very, very twisted. So I'm just thinking of Mrs. Sparsit. She wants her revenge on Louisa for marrying Bounderby, who she has designs on. She doesn't have really any imagination at all, but she imagines this elaborate staircase, and she just sees Louisa going down it, down and down and down into sort of shame. And also Stephen Blackpool, in love with Rachel and dealing with his very, very difficult wife. And he sees the gas lamps turning red, and he has these awful visions of allowing his wife to drink too much of the medicine that would kill her.
Yeah. Dickens is really terrific. I mean, I think our best, in fact, at monomania, the way in which the character, right, is in the grips of a kind of maniacal pursuit of something, or a guilt or a fear. You're totally right. That's a really great pairing of Stephen Blackpool's imagination of his fear about what might happen to his wife and what he might do. That is his own kind of dream of what might happen. Like guilty conscience. Dickens is so good at the repetitive nature of a guilty conscience. You just can't get it out of your mind. And then on the other side, in Mrs. Sparsit's case, the heights of imagination, that kind of ambition will instill in someone, and she relishes it. She feels a kind of deep power, and she's so watchful always in the novel, right? Up in the window in the bank, just keeping an eye on everything. And she's plotting.
Now, Mrs. Sparsit was not a poetical woman, but she took an idea in the nature of an allegorical fancy into her head. Much watching of Louisa keenly whetted and sharpened Mrs. Sparsit's edge in the way of inspiration. She erected in her mind a mighty staircase with a dark pit of shame and ruin at the bottom, and down those stairs, from day to day and hour to hour, she saw Louisa coming. It became the business of Mrs. Sparsit's life to look up at her staircase and to watch Louisa coming down, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, sometimes several steps at one bout, sometimes stopping, never turning back. If she had once turned back, it might have been the death of Mrs. Sparsit in spleen and grief.
There's no one who takes more pleasure in other people's suffering, right? And who's better than someone like Mrs. Sparsit. And there's no one better at depicting the pleasure that people take than Dickens. Right? He's keenly attuned to that. It's kind of the other side of his deep commitment to, the hearth and the home and the warm attachment to another person, compassion. And ultimately, I think for Dickens, people are often have hardened exteriors because they live in a hardened world. Beneath that hard-shelled exterior is a good person, right? Yeah. That deep down, if you could just get to them, or they're in just less worse circumstances, somehow they would be all right. Harthouse, someone like that, Sparsit, they're in a different category. There are those who are just going to stay that way.
When you mentioned Bounderby again, it reminds me, there's a bit where Harthouse is seeing Louisa for the first time, and he sort of notices how she's embarrassed by her husband Bounderby's braggart humility. And that phrase, braggart humility, made me wonder, humble brag.
Humble brag. Yeah,
Is that where it comes? I wonder whether that's where it comes from.
I don't know. It's like the most Dickensian word that we use today, right? And it's exactly the kind of showy humility that Dickens loves to indict and loves to depict.
Yeah. Yeah, and that thing that I'm just sort of digesting, that thing you were saying about guilt and that being suppressed and characters crushing their innermost impulses and desires to the point where they don't even know what they are sometimes.
Yeah.
I think the writing of young Tom Gradgrind's guilt is amazing, actually, because you sort of know, you have a very deep-centered feeling that he's done it, that he's robbed the bank. And Louisa has her suspicions.
Yeah.
But it's not that explicit and necessarily obvious, I don't think, in the way it's keyed into the novel. At least I didn't think so. Maybe I would if I reread it again. I'd probably see it more clearly. But that's really interesting.
I think you're right. It's not broadcast. And Louisa's not a naturally suspicious person, but she's got like a sororal sixth sense. And you know that the moment Tom takes Stephen Blackpool aside and says, maybe I can do something for you, that's the moment which would, like, the first time you're reading the novel, it's going to go one of two ways. Either Tom is going to turn out to be a really good guy, he too is moved, or he's using this for something else. And it's the latter. But badness will out in Dickens.
Yeah.
You know, that's the basic conviction, that it's going to seep up through your skin somehow and be visible in the way that you are moving through the world. Who you are will be shown somehow. And I think there's that sense, not quite in which you could see Tom's guilt, but like it's sensible. It's able to be perceived in some way by those who are closest to him.
Dickens refers to him as the whelp hundreds of times, doesn't he? Dickens very, very quickly sort of washes his hands of the character. There's no sort of escape for Tom. He's just going to go down and down and down one of Sparsit's staircases, really.
And then the hitman of fate shows up at the end. That is, so Tom gets shipped off somewhere thousands of miles away, maybe Australia. And then he almost makes it back to reconcile with his sisters. And then just as you think, okay, he's going to make it back, we're going to have this kind of happy reunion, dies of a fever.
And I suppose the last time the reader really sees him, he's disguised himself with blackface.
Yeah.
Which is really fascinating as well on so many levels, isn't it? Not just for back then, but for how we perceive that now. But it's like a last humiliation for him, isn't it?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about that. And I was thinking the ways in which the novel draws upon these images of what we would today call Orientalism to describe certain aspects of that world. So the Coketown has the painted face of a savage, and even the smoke being like a serpent. The serpent is a kind of image of the East. And so there's this way in which the pollution of Coketown, on the one side, Dickens really wants us to see it. So there are these kind of fantastical images and the fairy palaces illuminating, right, as a kind of depiction of the factories, which is this lovely image.
Yeah, but what's interesting about the fairy palaces is that you have to be in a train carriage passing Coketown from a distance to see the fires looking beautiful. Yeah, right.
But there's this way in which these kind of like racialized and orientalized images, it's a way both, I think, of the factories and the pollution and the terribleness that is spreading across the town. And it also puts it at a little bit of arm's length. Somehow, if it's Easternized, it's somehow not of this world. It's somehow of another world. And that's a pretty common trope in 19th century writing. Often that sense of like the East as this kind of slightly mysterious, magical, out of time, otherworldly sort of place, against which the West often will define itself as the good half of the globe. But in this case, I was really struck by the ways in which that bizarre way in which Tom ends up in blackface as a disguise, right, from the circus. It's this kind of strange racialization of him, which is meant to depict a kind of shame for him. And then it's also used in this sense almost to effect a transformation in him, right? That is, it's that which allows him to get away physically, that is not be recognized. But it's also the kind of beginning of what's something that would allow him to like start to become a slightly better person.
It's very hard to pin it down, isn't it? And of course, it's a very sensitive thing with our thinking today and everything. You want to be very, you want to be very careful about how you sort of examine it, and you want Dickens to be okay doing it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's interesting. I mean, the humiliation also, the fact, because he mocks the blackface, which I feel makes it okay, talking about Tom and his kind of fierce sweating. And so he ends up with these kinds of creases in his makeup.
These scenes show up throughout, often in 19th century literature, and they're for comic effect. And I think Dickens is a person of his time as much as anybody else, drawing upon certain kinds of practices and tropes that today we recognize as kind of part of this racialized discourse. I mean, it's certainly the case. The Dickens' own relationship to abolition in the U.S. is actually an interesting one. There's a scholar named Daniel Hack who's written a really interesting book about transatlanticism and transatlantic literature, and he talks about the fact that Bleak House was actually serialized in an abolitionist newspaper in the U.S. Okay. Yeah. So it was understood. It was received as actually a book that was, fighting against injustice, and that among those injustices was slavery, and that Dickens would be available to be enlisted in this cause. But I think it's an interesting moment at the end of the novel, because it's uncomfortable for us as readers today. I don't have a good sense. I don't have the expertise to actually think with you about how it would have landed in the 19th century. But I actually think that moment of discomfort is useful for us, because I think it can be easy to forget the ways in which Dickens is so compelling, social reformer, and, this kind of extraordinary figure of cultural production and writing, and that he depicts a world that both looks very different from ours and feels very modern, feels incredibly contemporary to ours. And I think that those kinds of even that moment, right, of a kind of uncomfortable resonance, those moments of uncomfortableness, I think are really helpful for us as readers. We can recognize the kind of ongoingness of certain kinds of gulfs, right? So anyway, it's such an interesting scene, though. I agree with you. There are a few things that are really notably contemporary about Dickens' vision of the environment and environmental degradation brought on by industrialization. And a lot of that has to do with smoke and with soot and with the smog of London, and its kind of vivid depiction of that. Wordsworth called London's fog London's own black reef, right? So that is this sense of a kind of sootiness hanging around it. And we get these images of smog and smoke and hard times. And there's a passage that actually, I only noticed it this time when I was reading it through, that is a kind of rewriting of that passage, that opening passage from Bleak House. It's from chapter 10. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just...
whatever you like.
If you're interested. So, in the hardest working part of Coketown, in the innermost fortifications of that ugly citadel, where nature was as strongly bricked out as killing airs and gases were bricked in, at the heart of the labyrinth of narrow courts upon courts and close streets upon streets, which had come into existence piecemeal, every piece in a violent hurry for some one man's purpose, and the whole an unnatural family, shouldering and trampling and pressing one another to death. In the last close nook of this great exhausted receiver, where the chimneys, for want of air to make a draught, were built in an immense variety of stunted and crooked shapes, as though every house put out a sign of the kind of people who might be expected to be born in it. Among the multitude of Coketown, generically called the Hands, a race who have found more favor with some people if Providence had seen fit to make them only hands, or like the lower creatures of the seashore, only hands and stomachs, lived a certain Stephen Blackpool, 40 years of age. That passage, it's one long sentence in the same way that opening of Bleak House is, right? And it's moving us closer and closer and closer to something. But whereas in Bleak House, you get to the center of the fog and there is no center there. It's just all diffuse in the same way that kind of malevolence is diffuse in Bleak House. In the center of this passage, we move from the more particular of the workers, the hands, and then to the one worker, one hand, Stephen Blackpool. That kind of centering of a person in the story, both on the good side, right? That is Stephen Blackpool, who is a kind of hero in the novel. The same thing happens on the other side. We know what causes the ill in hard times. We can point to it. It's the factories, it's utilitarian thinking, it's education, schools that are modeled on utilitarian thinking. It's not so identifiable in Bleak House. And I think that's one of the big differences. Like Hard Times, it wants you to see the smog, and it wants you to know factories, coal. That's what's producing environmental degradation.
Yeah. That's a wonderful passage, and it reminded me of two other passages that I can't quite quote, but when they talk about from a distance you can see Coketown before you can even see its buildings. You can sort of see in the air and the atmosphere around it the disturbance of nature and the sky above it. And also you mentioned the serpents a couple of times. And he mentions them a couple of times as well. It's not just one little passing illusion. Oh, they look a bit like serpents. They are serpents that are there. And there's that bit about where it rains and the serpents then start to droop down into the streets and sort of spread. Yeah. It's a wonderful book. Yeah, certainly from an environmental standpoint as well. I have to say, I mean, for my money, I really enjoyed it. It sounds, talking about it, it can sound so oppressive, can't it, because of the subjects. But it does actually... It does have the fun still, even if it's not spinning in the way a big multi-character novel is of his. So yeah,
I agree. But it's not all spinach. There's lots of delicious fruit in there and sugar, and it knows what it's about, right? Yeah. This novel, and it's kind of in tune with our own current moment, in that it does that thing of trying to speak truth to power in very specific terms, right? It's polemical in a way that feels familiar now. That is, it's got to tell it like it is.
Absolutely. Yeah. Gosh. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed talking to you so much about this. This has been brilliant.
Such a pleasure for me to be invited onto the show, which I'm a huge fan of and have really been enjoying. And what could be better than like hang out together for an hour and get to talk about a novel.
And now, as promised, here is a recording of the Bookshop Band performing The Tumbling Girl live at the Bath Literary Festival.
We live in hard times, we die in harder times, working for the man, the hard fact kind of man.
Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much, and see you next time.